Okay, so we're going to continue on. We're going to continue on from attaching the frame to the foundation, right? And so we're going to start with, and you've already heard me talk about this, and this is what I told you about this chapter where it repeats itself over and over again. So we're going back down to the foundation again. And how we attach this is we use a foundation sill, a sill plate, right, or a mud sill. And I'm going to mix it up and call it a mud sill because that's what I'm used to calling it. But it is a sill plate. Usually it's going to be pressure-treated wood. And we do that because it's in contact with the concrete, because it's in contact with moisture, right? If we didn't do that and we were inside a slab foundation, right, where we had a slab-on-grade foundation and we were building our walls directly on the concrete, right, our bottom plate would be acting as our mud sill, therefore it would need to be pressure-treated, right? If you're in an old home, something where we didn't have pressure-treated, you tore open a wall, you might see a redwood sill plate. That's not uncommon because it's resistant to rot. That's the point, and that's why we want to have it. Obviously, we're going to cut our costs and go with more of a pressure-treated product today, right? If we're in a seismic area, you may see that the sill plates are actually doubled up, right, which can help for structural loading, but it depends whatever the engineer is going to specify, right? If you need to level up your building, this is a good opportunity, so you can slide shims underneath. Concrete is not always perfect, so you can adjust for subtle imperfections with shims and get your sill plates nice and level. The other thing is if there's any interior cavity, right, anything that's not that's a habitable space, so not a crawl space, right, or something like that, but something that's a basement or whatever, you want to make sure you actually seal, right, this joint between the concrete and your sill plate for air infiltration. You don't want the air to be able to get through those little cracks, right? You want to make sure it's nice and sealed. And so that's some kind of a compressible, resilient material. In the picture, they're using a fiberglass insulation. But basically what that's doing is it's stopping any airflow through the crack. And the more environmentally conscious buildings, environmentally friendly buildings, the ones that perform better, right, for heating and cooling are going to have these kinds of seals, right? If you have an older building, they're going to be full of cracks, and if you stick your hand by an electrical outlet, this is classic my house. You put your hand near any electrical outlet, and the cold air will be coming through like crazy, right? You go around one of the doors or the windows, and you put your hand there, and there's like just cold air pouring in, right? So in a modern house, that kind of stuff, those kinds of sealers make a big difference. Okay, so the anchor bolts may be efficient to attach, right, just the foundation to the sill plate, right? In seismic areas where we have earthquakes, we're going to use far more elaborate hold downs that are designed to actually tie this building frame into the foundation. This is an example of one of the hold downs that we were talking a little bit about at the break, right? Much bigger steel horseshoe looking thing. We've got a bolt here that's going down into the foundation. This would be just the simple anchor bolt back here, right? So this goes into a big bracket that's then nailed or screwed, right, into a large post that's going up into the building, right? And so that bracket is able to transfer far more seismic load from the foundation up through the building, right? And they're very sophisticated in terms of how they tie the whole building together, and we talked a little bit about that at the break for individuals who are interested in it. And if somebody else is interested, we could talk more about it there. Unfortunately, the book doesn't cover it as extensively as I would like. It would also be a great opportunity if we could go to a California light frame building site on a field trip and you could see this stuff because it becomes really, really obvious if you see it, right? But we only have so much time, and going on a field trip at 9 at night probably wouldn't work. So it is what it is, right? So the floor framing is laid out so that the ends of the uncut 4-foot by 8-foot subflooring panels will fall directly over the joists, right? And so what we don't want to have happen is we don't want our plywood panel to fall somewhere in the middle of a joist bay, right? That wouldn't be good. We want to make sure that the ends always fall on a joist, which gives us appropriate nailing and appropriate support for our plywood subfloor, right? We're also going to make sure that we run those, right? And I've said this several times, but I'm going to keep repeating myself, perpendicular to the direction of the joists themselves, right? Always perpendicular. This is going to reduce waste time required for cutting. The standard joist spacing, the standard spacing for any framing member in lightwood frame, is going to be 16 inches on center or 24 inches on center. And on center just means that if we measured from the center of one board to the center of the next board, that would be 16 inches, right? And so the 16 inches on center, it's just like if you ever are trying to hang a picture on a wall or something like that, right? You find one stud, you can measure over 16 inches, and chances are there's another stud there, right? If you find one, you can usually find the rest of them, right? So that's what on center is, okay? In the world of engineered lumber, it's not a surprise that we've moved away from typical traditional wood floor joists and we've gone into the I-joists instead. They're used almost exactly the same way as traditional joists would be used. There's a couple differences in terms of how they attach blocking to these pieces, but it's very much similar. So we've looked at a framing example here, and certainly if you were at a wood construction site today, chances are they would be made out of engineered lumber, something like this. Remember, we can span a little bit further. They stay truer and straighter, and they don't shrink, all that being a good advantage toward using it, right? Notice we also have an oriented strand lumber, OSL, rim joist that's running around the outside. It's solid so that we have a little bit more meat, and we have a face to attach our exterior sheathing or our siding to, right? If this was an I-joist, it would be much more awkward, right, to attach anything to. Likewise, it would be more awkward to attach the I-joist coming the opposite direction together, right, if this was an I-joist. So we have a nice solid rim joist, and we have our I-joist here, right? They don't shrink as much. They're straighter and more uniform, and they can span greater different distances at the same depth, right? So notice another floor. I tried really hard when I was picking the images to, before this slide, all of them were regular wood frame, right? And now it's like, okay, we talked about it, so most of these could be engineered lumber, right? So we install the subflooring, right? We fasten it into place. To reduce squeaking, right, we're at least going to glue it before we nail it. So we use what's called subfloor adhesive, which comes in a big caulking tube, right? And you squirt it out over the top of the joist, right? And then you put your plywood panels down and you nail those into place. If you're being a really good contractor and you're willing to sacrifice a little bit of money, right, you'll actually screw the subfloor down instead of just nailing it, right? And that's really going to eliminate any of the squeaks that are inside because it just can't squeak, right? If you glue it and you screw it, it can't squeak, which is good, right? So the plywood, it can be OSB, right? Depending on what's available and cost, you can vary. Different people have different philosophies about what they would choose to use in a building. If you were building sometime during the summer, I would have no problem using OSB everywhere. If you were building in a time where you knew it was going to be raining while you were building, I'd have a little bit of an issue because the OSB can delaminate in weather. So that might be a choice that would, if I was building in, February or something, I would be worried about that. Certainly if I was building in the middle of summer or even spring like now, right, there might be a little bit of rain, but it's not going to rain for, a month solid or something like that. So I would have no problem using OSB. It just depends a little bit on the philosophy and a little bit on the cost as well, right? So we're always going to run those panels perpendicular to the direction of the joist. They're stiffer in that direction, so we look at the grain pattern on the plywood. It's always in the long direction anyway, right? And we run those so that the grain pattern on the top and the bottom, right, is running in the long direction perpendicular to the joists, right? So remember back to that plywood section. Plywood is manufactured an eighth of an inch smaller than the actual 4 feet by 8 feet. That little eighth of an inch gives us a little bit of a gap so that if these wood panels expand and contract a little bit, they're not going to cause your floor to buckle, right? So we have a little bit of room in there to make sure. Sometimes subfloor, a lot of times subfloor, has tongues and grooves attached to it, so you can actually slide those pieces together, right, which makes it a more uniform, solid platform. But it depends on the engineer, and it depends on what plywood and where you can get it from, right? And that helps, obviously, to tie the whole thing together. Bridging, right, which can be solid blocking, right, or a metal cross-bracing system. If you're in California, it's very unlikely that you're going to find any of these rinky-dinky little tiny metal braces, right? Chances are you're going to find nice, good, solid blocks, right? No cross braces, just nice, solid blocks. If you're in an older house, though, and you tear down a ceiling, you'll see this cross bracing. That's what they used to do. They also used to do on outside walls, instead of shear walls, they would do let-in diagonal braces. right? So if you've torn open an old wall, I guarantee you my house has it. It was built in the 50s. That's like classic. They're going to be let in diagonal braces. That's their way of stabilizing the building frame. Not nearly as good as a shear wall, right? So not exceeding 8 feet, right? We don't want more than 8 feet that doesn't have a block in it. It's amazing how much this really stiffens up the floor platform. I have a barn. This is my personal barn. It's not really a barn for animals. It's a barn for crap, basically tractors and stuff like that, right? Tools, vibrators, plates, I don't know, whatever else, all that kind of stuff. Anyway, it's a 2-story building. It's built with TJIs for the second floor, so it can get span. It's 22 by 40 in size, and when we built it, we were lazy. This is a classic. If you're building something for yourself, you get lazy, right? And so we didn't block the ceiling right away, right? We built it up. We put the subfloor on, and we kept moving. We built the second story and moved on, right? And if you go up on that floor, or before we put the blocking in, it was so much more shaky, right? You were up on that floor moving around. It was kind of creepy, right? You go in there, you add all this solid blocking, you tie that together in a nice solid platform, and you go up there now, it's perfectly flat, perfectly solid, right? And so the point is that the blocking really does make a big difference, and you should put it in, right? Yeah. These are both cross braces, right? That's existing wood bridging, which is the cross bracing. These are the new steel bridging. There is no solid blocking, right? The next side, I think, shows solid blocking. Solid blocking is basically, no, it doesn't show solid blocking there. I don't know. I will find a picture of solid blocking. It's a solid piece of wood that goes in between. I have a picture. Eventually we'll get there, right? If your floor joist is going to span across a beam, so we have a beam like this, the floor joist spans across, that's a perfect place to put the blocking and will help tie the whole building frame together. Right? It's better than even in the mid-span. Okay? So we talked about joist hangers before. This is what I was talking about a joist hanger. And the idea is where the end of a joist, right, butts into a joist that's running perpendicular, right? This is the ideal place for some kind of a joist hanger because there's not enough nailing to adequately nail that joint. Okay? So we're going to use something like this, right, which is going to attach all these little holes or places for nails, right? We're going to be able to attach to the beam, right, or the joist, or the doubled up joists, right through this panel. This wraps around and underneath the joist that's running in the opposite direction, so the joist can sit in, and then there's holes in this that attach this bracket to that little joist hanger, right? So we're tying those pieces together. This example in the back, I think, has they put little foil places. Like there's a little joist hanger there, right? And so there's a few little examples where they put them in. And so depending on, this is the only one that actually shows it. I knew the students who did that one. So it varies a little bit. But the idea is that just becomes a pocket, right, that the joist can actually rest in. Right? And the one kind of misnomer about a joist hanger is the joist very rarely actually rests on this metal bracket, right? The nails that hold it into place support the joist, and when the joist shrinks, it shrinks a little bit up from the bottom and a little bit down from the top, right? And so it doesn't actually rest on it. I'm gonna do a whole lecture on stairs, so we'll talk about stairs down in a couple weeks, right? But if you were doing stairs and you had a stringer running down, you can actually cut a notch out and slide, so it's hanging the top part of the joist, but not the bottom part, the top part of the stringer, but not the bottom part. Anyway, we'll save that for stairs, right? So wall framing is laid out exactly the same as floor framing would be, right? The stud is going to repeat on an even interval, right? And it's going to be between the sheathing panels. Okay? Most wall cavities are going to be 2x4, right? Though with environmental concerns about insulation and that sort of thing, walls are going up in size, more in the 2x6 realm. If you have any kind of seismic activity, chances are your wall is going to get a little bit thicker. And we're talking exterior walls for the most part. Interior walls still tend to be 2x4, right? Walls can be greater than that, It just depends on your particular building. So a good example of the insulation value, if you have just a 2x4 wall and you put fiberglass insulation, a bat, and we'll talk about in the interior exterior finishes, we'll talk about fiberglass insulation, and I'll show you examples of that. If we were to put that in, we'd have an R value of 13 of that wall, right? If we were to have a 2x6, the value, the R value, which basically is how much heat can transfer through the building. I mean, we could spend a whole class talking about how this terminology and whatever. The point is, the higher the R value, the better, right? In terms of less heat gets out, right? Less cold gets out, or vice versa, right? If you go up to a 2x6 wall, you jump up to R19, right, from R13. So you get almost double what you had before, right? So it's a big difference for those extra 2 inches. So if you have any kind of a climate that requires more insulation, you're going to go up in the size of your wall, right? If you go up even further, let's say you're in the middle of the desert and you need to have extra insulation, right? You might build your building out of concrete anyway, but if you had a wood frame building in the desert, right, you might do 2x8 walls to give yourself even more insulation. If you were up in Alaska, you might give yourself 2x8 walls, right? Because it allows you to have that extra insulation in the wall cavity, right? If you have a really long span, going back to that balloon framing, something like this building here, right, where we have a very long stud that needs to be straight, right, if you're going to buy a regular stud, you're going to have to buy select structural, and you're going to really hope and pray that it doesn't twist on you, right, because it can be long. We could get them up to 24 feet, right, long, but you can also get manufactured structural composite studs. They could be finger-jointed studs, something like that, that would be straighter, right, that would have better engineered components that could act at it. It's not that common. I haven't run across it, but it's available, right? So headers run above doors, right? So in the floor, headers were for an opening, right? Same thing happens in a wall, okay? This is kind of the easiest way to understand a header, right? They run above doors, windows, and openings, right? So they head, right, the door or the window or whatever. They're above, okay? Headers are sized based on building code criteria and how much load is on top of them, right, that's coming down on top of them. They can be an LVL, a PSL. They could be dimension lumber, depending on the span, the length, right, how much weight, etc., right? So most of the time they're going to be engineered of some sort. Of course, the example that I show you isn't engineered, but they vary, okay? So the headers are going to rest, and we're going to draw this in a second so we can make sure you guys understand this, right? So this big thing here is the header, right? The headers need to rest on something. And so remember, as much as possible, we're trying not to require special metal contraptions or anything to hold these pieces together. We'd like for one member to rest on another member. That's the easiest, cleanest way to do it, right? So the header is going to rest on a shorter stud on either side of the window. So you see that little bit of shorter stud and see how the header extends over, right, and rests on it? That shorter stud is called a trimmer, right? It could be called a jack stud. I'm used to calling it a trimmer, right? Either way is fine, right? Those trimmers or jack studs, right, are nailed to a larger stud that goes the full length, right, past the header, there and there, right? And that's called a king stud. That's the full height stud, right? So, does that make sense so far? Header at the top, trimmer, right, or jack stud, king stud on the outside. Okay? Down at the bottom, right, we're going to have what's called a rough sill, right? And that then is supported by these shorter studs, which are called cripple studs, right? And it's always very interesting how these things come and go. When I was in class, doing these kinds of construction things, we couldn't call these cripple studs. They had some other name for them because it was like politically incorrect to call them cripple studs. And then now it's come back and it's perfectly fine. So if you go back like 2 versions of the book, if it was like, the 3rd edition, it wouldn't call them cripple studs, and that would be eliminated. So, it's just, whatever. These are cripple studs. I think because the industry has always called them cripple studs, that's what they will always be, right? You just can't switch it. It's just like trimmers is like, it's always, I can't call them jack studs. I have to call them trimmers because that's what I've always called them. I don't know. So anyway, either of those is fine, right? And so we end up with a window opening, and we'll talk about how do you flash the window and insert the window and install the window and everything next class, right? So having just talked about that, right, this is a good thing to actually draw out, right, in your sketchbook, because when I have something like this, it does like to show up on a test, right? So take a little bit of time and see how you did. We just went through it, so it shouldn't be too challenging. And if you printed the slides, don't look at the answers. Right? Try to do it without it. So how'd you guys do? Good. You ready for me to move on, or you need more time? Okay. So up top here at number 1, we have the top plate, right? Notice that it is doubled, so a lot of times you'll hear double top plate. And I think I have a slide that illustrates that a little bit better later on. But in case I don't, I'm going to talk about the top plate since we're here. And talking about it. The reason that it's doubled, right, is that we don't want to point in a wall where we have a joint. So let's imagine that we had a wall longer than is feasible. Let's say it's 30 feet long, right? In the middle of the wall, there'd be a joint, right? And that joint would be a weak spot on that wall, right? So by doubling up the top plate, by having 2, we can span across that joint and have that act as a much stronger member, right? Likewise, if we come to a corner, right, it's pretty hard to attach the corners together. So what we'll do is we'll run the bottom of one, right, and the top of the other across each other, and now we'll be able to have a nice strong corner, which is why the tops are doubled up. The bottoms don't matter so much because we have a nice solid platform across the bottom, and we have something to attach it to no matter where it is, right? So it's a nice stable thing. So just a little bit about philosophy there. So on top of that, we have a header, which is right up here, right? The header rests on the jack studs or the trimmers, which are these shorter studs on either side. The king stud is the one that runs all the way up and down the outside of each of these drawings. We have a rough sill, which is at the top of the window opening, or excuse me, at the bottom of the window opening. Underneath that, we have our cripple studs, followed by our sole plate at the very bottom, right? So that's a good nutshell of what the wall assembly would be. These little short pieces, right, that go up from the header to the double top plates are also called cripple studs. They vary depending on how big the header is, right? If the header is big enough to span the full distance, then we don't have to worry about it. So if you look at your individual models, right, in most cases, the headers are big enough to span all the way up to the double top plates. I think they pretty much all are. This one, it's a little bit hard because it's a gable end of a roof, but we do have some cripples that are above the header. That would probably be the best example of any of the ones that we have. Right. So in this case, right, no, there's just double top plate. Oh, there's that. My guess is that they just screwed up and picked the wrong size piece. There are always mistakes in these that aren't quite resolved, right? The rough sill doesn't sit on top of the trimmer because it's not really supporting any weight, right? Which is a little bit weird until we get to the interior-exterior finishes. But a window is attached through these little flanges, right? And we can see a little bit of it right here. Luckily, you're right here, so you can see it a little bit here. So we have a window here, and it's got a little flange that runs around the outside. right, that's actually attached into, and so the window hangs. It doesn't rest on the rough sill. So the rough sill doesn't actually have to support any weight. And so that's why it doesn't have to have a trimmer underneath. If for some reason whatever was going in the opening needed to support weight, then you'd need to put the trimmers underneath, right? A lot of times contractors will actually go ahead and put little mini trimmers underneath just because it's easier to install, right? It's easier to throw those on either side. Or a really long span. Yeah. Yeah, I would argue that it would just be a cripple stud. It just depends on the placement. Yeah. Yeah, yeah. And so these are the kinds of things that they just happen. Yeah. Fred, did you have something to add too? No? Okay. So again, we're going with the, whatever the book says is what we're saying. But these kinds of things evolve, right? No surprise. So this is a layout of a typical wall minus the framing, right? So we have a couple corner conditions. This is an interior wall. That's another corner. We have a door and we have a window, right? If this were here, you knowing what you know now should probably be able to actually lay out what the framing would look like in a particular wall, right? And so we're going to try to dive through this a little bit and talk through what all the individual pieces are. I don't think I have one. Yeah, I have it. I have some highlights that happen along the way, but I don't actually think I have them labeled, right? And so what we're going to do is we're going to start with, obviously we have window openings, so we're going to have to work around the window and the door openings, right? But we want to make sure that our exterior sheathing, right, will fall on 4 feet or 8 feet. So our studs have to match up with that 16 inches on center. So we need to start from one side or the other of the wall and make sure that we have, right, studs that are going to appear at 16 inches on center, right? And so we'll go through and we'll identify the position of where those studs are, right? So we have here, 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 right? And we go under the window, right? This one's one of it's the trimmer of the window, right? Then we continue along here, skipping the corner, right? We continue along here, right? There's one, right? We go up here, there, and there. Does that kind of make sense? So we make sure that that has that even spacing, right? After that, I thought I had more. No, of course, it would be nice if I had a few more highlights, right? Then we're going to come in, right, and we're going to identify where our corners of our window are. This happens to fall. This trimmer falls on one of our studs. That's great, right? But we need another side of this window, right? That's not on the 16 inches on center. So that's going to fall in between one, but we still need our king stud and our trimmer to support the window, right? Likewise, when we get to the door, over here we do have one of our 16-inch on-center studs does match up with the door. That's fine. It wouldn't have to, right? But over here we don't have that. So we're going to make sure that we have that king stud and our trimmer there as well, right? Likewise, the cripples, right, need to match up. They need to match up here and here, right? So we have that even spacing. That's kind of the key thing to understand. It's always going to have to maintain that spacing, right? So this is what I was talking about a let-in diagonal brace, kind of the old-fashioned way of doing it. They would actually notch out, right, through each one of these beams a diagonal brace, right? If you have an older house, you might find this. The other thing that you might find is that there's sheathing on the outside of this wall that runs diagonally, where you have a bunch of boards that run diagonally. That's the other way of doing it that they used to do. And that's acting similar to what a shear wall would do today, where it's trying to resist some seismic loading or lateral loading of some kind. Okay? The other thing that we have to do is we have to be able to frame out a corner of a building. Okay? And so the logical thing to say was, I have a 2x4 wall. Let's just put a 4x4 post in the corner. That'll frame out the building just fine, right? And it works fine from the outside, but not from the inside. And that's the key thing to understand is if we're going to put any kind of an interior finish on this building, let's say we're going to put sheetrock inside, right? In that corner, we need something to nail the sheetrock to, right, when it comes to the very corner. And if we had a 4x4 post, all we'd have was the corner of the 4x4 post. So we really wouldn't have any nailing, right? So our method for doing, right, framing out corners is always going to be a way of giving us, right, nailing for interior and exterior, right? And so in this particular configuration, right, we have nailing on this corner and we have nailing on this corner, right? Likewise, we have nailing on this interior corner and nailing on that interior corner. That make sense? Right? If we come down here to this corner, same concept, right? We have, right, nailing here for the interior, right? Nailing here for the interior. We have nailing here, and we have nailing here for the exterior, right? This is a little piece of blocking that goes in between these two pieces. This is the most common one that I've seen, right? But that is probably just how I learned it, right? This is just as viable. Does that make sense? Right? And I think if you understand the philosophy for why it has to be framed this way, it makes more sense. It's all about making sure you have nailing for your sheetrock or for your exterior siding or shear walls or whatever else you're putting up, right? An interior corner, right, depending on how you're doing it, right, and whether it's structural or non-structural, you have a couple different options. This is the most common that I've run into, okay? And here we're adding, right, studs on either side of this wall. We have a piece of blocking that goes between them, and then we have a stud right against this piece of blocking, right? Gives us nailing here and there, here and there, right? Another example up here, this is probably for an interior non-load-bearing partition, although it doesn't say that, which is kind of concerning, right? We have some blocking here. We have a little 1x8 that's been nailed on here for nailing, which is a little funky, right? And then we have our board that's here, right? It gives us nailing right into the wall, no problem, that stud, and our nailing can come through this board there on either side. This is not my favorite corner, but it's doable. Okay? So if we look at the wall as a whole, right? This is our overall framing. We have a variety of openings that have header conditions, right, in them. We have some temporary diagonal braces that are holding this into place. This is framing out, right, laying these out on the flat surface before they're tipped up into position, right, which is the easiest way, obviously, to put the walls together, right? A couple little edge details, and I know we go through a lot of drawings in here, and we have to because this is explaining how this building goes together, right? To review the floor, we have our sill plate or our mud sill with our anchor bolt. This is our joist. There's our rim joist with our subfloor. We move up, right? Right here would be our bottom plate. We have our stud coming up, and we have our double top plate, right? This is an interior condition, right? It's bearing on top of this I-beam, which we talked about. This has a piece of blocking that's tying the joist together. Subfloor goes across. What's above looks exactly the same as an exterior wall, right? We move to this exterior wall. It's just the flipped version, right? So the rim joist is right here on the outside, right? There's our bottom plate, our stud, and our double top plate, subfloor, right? And the bearing goes straight down through. Okay, so if we had a non-load-bearing interior partition, we can be much more flexible about where we put it in, right? We can have a sole plate and a single top plate because it's non-load-bearing. We're not worried about load, and we can have our studs put in, right? This is a good example of something like this would be inside an office, right, where you're actually putting in steel studs, right? And so I told you a lot that the steel would coincide with the wood. Same kind of a thing, single top plate, single bottom plate, non-load bearing, right? Nothing special. It's just providing a surface to separate two rooms, right? If your non-load bearing wall falls in between, right, but parallel to a series of joists, we need to have blocking underneath it, right? So they're not putting this weight and causing the floor to sag. But again, it's non-load bearing. It's just supporting the weight of the wall and the sheetrock itself, right? And likewise, we still need some nailing, right, up above. So we need to make sure that we have some ability, right, to attach our sheetrock and that sort of thing, right? But again, that's non-load bearing. So this is tipping that wall up into place. So you're going to frame that wall out flat on the ground. Afterward, you're going to lift it up into place. Makes it much easier to put it together. Once you get, right, the corners together, I apologize, some of these slides are blurry. Right? Once you get the corners together, you'll actually attach the corners. You'll assign temporary braces to keep it together until you can put that floor platform on top. Remember, in light wood frame, it's all about the individual members becoming a whole unit. Right? When they're individual members, they're not acting structurally yet. Right? So when we have these walls just tipped into place, they have no shear panels on them yet. They haven't been tied together. They have no platform on top, so they're still flimsy. They're still not perfectly stable. They're going to work together as an overall structural unit, right? So I told you guys I'd show you a couple examples that I was trying to draw at the break, right? This is if you're doing some kind of a seismic hold down that's going through your building, right? So this is the earthquake zone stuff that we're going to talk about, right? We're going to, instead of having an anchor bolt that comes up through and attaches through our mud sill, or in this case our double mud sills, or our double sill plates, right? We're going to carry that bolt all the way up through the floor frame, right? So here we would have our double sill plates. We'd have our joist. We'd have our subfloor. We'd have our bottom plate. So we're carrying it all the way through that whole section, right? And then we're bolting it into a bracket that's then tying to a special grouping of studs. This could be a solid 4x6 or something, but it could also be a grouping of 3 studs together, and we're bolting that whole piece together. When we continue going up through the building and we get to the second floor platform, right, we have the reverse condition. We have the bolts running through those 3, right, into this steel, right? Then the bolt is going to continue all the way up through the upper floor platform. So through the double top plates, through the joist, right, through the subfloor, through the bottom plate, right, and all the way up to our wall up above, right, and tie it together into the wall up above. Okay? I've seen these done where there's actually a very tight spring that helps to dampen and deflect the forces of an earthquake, right? So it's an escape. So instead of just trying to be stronger than the earthquake, you can actually allow the building to flex a little bit, which will help the building in an earthquake, right? And so anyway, the point is that you're creating a very, very strong steel line that's running all the way through the building, so that if you have an extreme lateral force going at a building, right, from one direction or another, that steel line is going to help the building stay attached to the foundation and work as a structural unit rather than break the building apart, right? And so this is the kind of thing that's going to be seen in more multi-story or multi-family. So if you're thinking about 2 or 3 stories, that's where you're going to start to see this stuff, right? If it's a single-story home, much less likely that you're going to see something this, substantial, okay? So if you're using an I-joist, a TJI, I wanted to call them TJIs, but that's the brand name. If you're using an I-joist of some kind, when you reach, right, the outside wall condition, right, where we're reaching our rim joist, we want to be able to make sure that we have some kind of a way of attaching this nice and strong, right? So we put these little web stiffeners in, which is basically another piece of wood that sits inside against the web that allows this to then, right, be a little bit stronger when it reaches its end condition. Does that make sense? Right? Likewise, right, if we're joining together, this is an interior wall condition, and so we would actually put in blocking right in here, why it's not shown, I have no idea, right? There should be blocking in here that gives you that. Basically, you're trying to bridge the gap, right? If you have an I-joist here and you have an I-joist coming into it, you'd have a gap in the middle, and you need to make sure there's blocking there. This is a terrible drawing, right? Anyway, we can continue on. That last one doesn't really matter. So here's the actual picture example. Hopefully this makes a little bit more sense, right? We're using a joist hanger here to attach this I-joist to the beam, right? But we need this blocking to make sure that it attaches well. And, if we didn't have that piece of blocking in, we'd only have this bottom to nail to, right? We'd have no nailing, no way of attaching this together. So that's what that blocking, that web stiffener is for. Okay? So we move up, and we make our second floor platform exactly the same way that we made our first floor platform, right? Where we on top of those double top plates, which have been overlapped at the corners, we lay out all our joists. Right? Once we have all our joists laid out and our headers, etc., right? We continue our way up. We put our subfloor on. We get a nice solid second floor platform. We can continue and build our walls from there. Right? I used to talk a little bit about stairs, but I separated the stairs out into another lecture, so we'll talk about stairs down the road. So we have our second floor wall platforms, or second floor walls that are built on our second floor platform and then tipped up into position exactly the same way we did with the first. Okay? Once we get to the very top, we have to then build a roof. And so there'll be a lecture on roofing, right, and roofing materials and how we do roofing and all the rest of it. But at this stage and in this chapter, they do want you to know kind of the basic types of roofs so that you can understand what types are. So we have our basic flat roof, right? And so flat roofs don't have a lateral thrust that is exerted outward, right? Because there's no pitch to them, right? And they're not pushing out on the building, which will make more sense when we get to the gables, etc. But it is important to understand that a flat roof isn't actually flat. It still has to have some slope to it, right? So it's not really flat, but it looks relatively flat, right? We can have a shed or a single pitch roof, which basically means it's higher on one end, lower on the other end, and it's going to shed the water in one direction or another, right? Really big in the 70s to have shed roofs, right? We can have a gable roof, which is very traditional. You know, when you drew a house as a little kid, this is probably what you drew, right? Because it's somehow symbolic of a house. But we have a peak, right? And we have a gable that goes up. We can have it in two different conditions, right? We can have it where we have a ceiling joist that runs across. That is then holding our sheetrock. It's a contained room, right? Or we can have it where we have a ridge beam that runs across the top. This one here is a good example of that. Obviously, it's a steeper roof, but it is basically a gable. More of an A-frame, but it has a ridge beam that runs across the top, which is a much thicker beam, and it's completely open on the interior, right? We can have what's called a hip roof, which is basically a gable roof from all four sides, right? So we have a gable going in both directions, and so it's tipped back. We can have the same thing happen in a hip roof that we're having in a gable roof. Then we can move up to a gambrel roof, which is basically what you would consider to be a barn roof, right? Where we have steep sides, right, and then a flatter top, and then a steep side. Best way to describe it is a barn, right? Because that's what we think of as a barn, right? And then a mansard roof is basically the same thing as a gambrel roof, but it's on four sides, so it's tipping back that way, right? So that's the basic types. We'll get into roofing far more extensively down the road. Likewise, when we get into the roofing chapter, we're going to repeat a lot of the terminology that I'm talking about here, right? So it's good because you get it a couple different times. So this is a roof framing plan so that we understand where our rafters are going to go. Our rafters are our evenly spaced parallel members, just like our joists and our studs. And so our rafters are going from our ridge board or our ridge beam, depending. Ridge beam is bigger. Ridge board is if there's some kind of a ceiling joist system underneath, right, where we don't have any spanning capability. So, for example, this would be a ridge beam, right? It's thicker. It's carrying the load of all these rafters, right, across the top. Something like, that one's made with trusses, so that one doesn't count. Something like this one, right, would be a ridge board. It's just the same dimension as one of the rafters. Up top there where it's open, right, would be a ridge beam. See how it's a much thicker beam? Right? It obviously is supporting some kind of a larger, open story or something, right, where this is closed and we've got the joist underneath, right? So you guys on this one, these are just ridge boards, right? This one's a ridge beam here, right, and it goes to a ridge board over here. Right, because you have the ceiling joist below it. Make sense? And this one's so small that it's hard to see, but they're trusses anyway. Okay. So, in terms of laying out, right, our rafters, right, obviously they're on a slope, so we have to think about what that slope would be, right? Typical roof slopes, and we'll go over this all in the roofing lecture. Typical roof slopes on something like this are going to be like a 4 and 12, a 6 and 12, something like that, going up to a 12 and 12, right? And basically the idea here is that you're measuring, right, your rise over your run. So if it's a 6 and 12, you're going to go up 6 inches and over 12 inches, right? And so that's going to help you lay out this board and take construction 135, and anybody in that right now? No? So has Joe gone into that yet? How to lay out your rafters? Okay. Well, it's coming. It's coming. And you guys will go through and learn how to actually lay out your rafters. Okay? I'm trying to think if there's anything else I really want to talk about on this slide. No, we'll continue on. Okay? So when we get up here into our roof framing diagram, in this particular example, we have a ridge board because we have the ceiling joist. Right? It's not a big open area, so we don't have a beam. Our rafters are evenly spaced. Right? And so this is page 202 in your book. And I would say if you could go through page 202 and you could label everything that's on it, that would be a really good test that you actually understand this stuff. Right? So when you're coming into the final, this would be a really good review page because it goes all the way down to the foundation. Right? And you can think about the foundation, and it goes all the way up through the building, and you have a pretty good idea of all the terminology that goes with your light wood frame construction. Okay, so I'm not going to go through it now, but I think it would be a really good thing for you to review down the road. Okay. So in terms of the roof framing, and again, part of the reason that we're skipping through roof a little bit is because we're going to spend a bunch of time when we talk about roofing, right, talking about all this stuff. So once we have our rafters laid out, this is obviously a dormer that's been framed in to bring in light. But we're going to put our sheathing on top of the roof, right? And then on top of that, we'll put our roof material itself. But that sheathing acts as that diaphragm just like it does on the floor, just like it does on the wall. It ties the whole thing together, right? If we have just a little bit of terminology, and we will review this. Yeah, totally. Typically, you don't dimension them. You leave that for the general contractor to do. Yeah, you get out of it a little bit. But where you would actually be able to get that measurement is you take it from a section, right, or you take it from a building elevation, right. So you're not going to dimension them on a plan. It's kind of one of those things that you're going to flip through and reference a different piece of it. Okay? Yeah, because looking at it, if you're looking at a roof plan, right, what it's showing you is the location of the rafters, but not much else, right? The location of the dormer, that kind of thing. So we're going to go through these terminologies again when we get to roofing, right? But in terms of a hip, right, we have what's called a hip rafter, right, and we have what's called a valley or jack rafter, right? And so this would be the valley rafter here that goes up the side. The hip rafter would be going up here, right? And I think the only hip is in the back there. And so it has a hip rafter, and there isn't a valley rafter on any of these. Oh, this one has a valley rafter right here. Right? So you've got a hip rafter here, and you've got a valley rafter here. Right? These are both hip rafters on the outside. There's a valley rafter there. So you've got a hip rafter and a hip rafter. Right? And so those are even longer and even harder to figure out. So you guys get to have fun doing that in 135. Okay, so we'll continue on, right? A couple more things. If we have an extension, right, we couldn't continue with our rafters being parallel to one another and just have one floating out here in space because it doesn't have anything to support it, right? So if you have an overhang, you have to have these things that are called lookouts that flip and turn the opposite direction. You can see them on this one. This is probably the best example here, right, where the lookouts have to turn and go the opposite direction, so you actually have something to support what's called the fly rafter, which is on the very outside, right? So those are called lookouts, and they're just shifting. It's the same thing like a cantilever, like we talked about on the ground floor, though they don't have to tie back as far, right? The rule when it was an actual platform where you were walking on it, putting furniture on it, was 2/3 to 1/3 of an overhang. This is about half and half. But it works out fine because it's not that much weight on it, just the roof, right? So that's laying out roof framing, nailing roof, right? So one last example, and then I'll get you guys out of here a little bit early. This is the Thorn Crown Chapel in Arkansas. Anybody heard of this before? No? Really? Few architecture people, please? Maybe you've seen it once or twice, right? So to me, this is a perfect example of a light wood frame construction building and really taking advantage of a light wood frame construction building, right? So if we look at the outsides here, right, they're spaced a little bit more than our typical, right, spacing would be, right? But that's to give ourselves the openings. But every one of these individual members, right, is just a typical dimension lumber piece, right? And so we end up with a building, right, that is very, very transparent because we're using all these light individual members to make up the primary structure of this building, right? Now they've played around and they've done some really fun stuff with the trusses that hold up the roof. In that every place these join together, right, there's a steel bracket, but the steel bracket has been left empty, right? So instead of having them crossed, we have those little empty pieces. It's kind of one of those nice, creative architectural details that really makes the building, right? But when you understand structure and understand how it works and how you're going to combine steel with wood, it can be a really good example, right? We go over here to the outside, right, and we work down the side. You can see how thin the walls are relative. Obviously, this is not the kind of thing that you want to be in the winter because it would be frigid, right? But this is not for environmental reasons that we're talking about it. But you get this really open, airy feel that I think is pretty indicative of a light wood frame building. Right, another example there. And we're done. Okay? So, next week, it's kind of a lot of reading. At least leaf through it. It does have a lot of pictures to it. It's interior and exterior finishes, and so we have to talk about building services and kind of enclosing the building, siding, all that kind of stuff, right? And what? And most likely a quiz. The the quiz will, in all likelihood, cover the last 3 chapters, so it'll be basically all about wood. Hint, hint.